Difference and Repetition. By Gilles Deleuze. Translators. Preface. Difference and Repetition was first published in 1968. It was Deleuze's principal thesis for the Doctorat d'état. Expressionism in Philosophy, Spinoza, published in the same year, was his accompanying secondary thesis. The Logic of Sense, Athlone, 1990, appeared the following year. This interrelated body of writing marks the border between two phases of Deleuze's career, one side facing the earlier texts of an unorthodox historian of philosophy, the other facing his subsequent work, alone and with Guattari. If the study of Spinoza is the more strictly scholarly undertaking, then Difference and Repetition is the first book in which Deleuze begins to write on his own behalf. As such, it occupies a pivotal place in his oeuvre. Difference and Repetition is a work of prodigious conceptual invention in which Deleuze draws upon his earlier readings of Plato, Hume, Bergson, Nietzsche and Kant, as well as elements of contemporary science and art, to weave together a physics and a metaphysics of difference. If this amounts to a critique of the philosophy of representation which has dominated European thought since Plato, then it does so in the same manner that Anti-Oedipus amounts to a critique of psychoanalysis, namely, by proposing a retrospective analysis on the basis of an alternative. The different kinds of multiplicity found in Bergson, the ontology of eternal return understood as the being of that which differs and a transcendental empiricism of the faculties are among the elements of Deleuze's earlier studies which are here woven into a systematic philosophy of difference. Representation is replaced by the expression or actualization of ideas, where this is understood in terms of the complex notion of difference/ciation. The system is grounded only in the repetition of difference, or the repetition of ideal problems, which precisely amounts to a non-ground or groundlessness. As befits the exposition of a novel metaphysical system, there is occasional recourse to neologisms. These include some terms which are Deleuze's own inventions, and which I have attempted to render into appropriate English equivalents, such as a presentation or the recurrent notion of the disparate. A more significant case arises from the need to make a terminological distinction in English where no equivalent exists for the corresponding French terms. Thus, Deleuze makes significant use of the distinction in French between differencia, to make or become different, and differentia, which is restricted to the mathematical operation. Because of the extent and significance of his use of this distinction, which becomes apparent in Chapter 4, I have had to follow his terminology and introduce differentiate as a term of art in English. On the whole, however, difference and repetition achieves its effects by means of no typographical cleverness, no lexical agility, no blending or creation of words, no syntactical boldness. The problems which it poses for the translator are of another order. These include, first, problems raised by the diversity of philosophical languages deployed in the course of this book. For the most part, I have followed the terminology employed in the standard English translations of the primary texts in question, for example, following the authorized translations of Bergson and using extensity for étendue, see Chapter 5. In some cases, however, where standard French terminology differs from the English in ways which relate to important aspects of Deleuze's project, I have followed the French. For example, Deleuze uses the term ideas, in standard Platonic or Kantian senses, but then develops his own concept of ideas which owes as much to Leibniz and contemporary structuralism as it does to Kant or Plato. In order to maintain the continuity in Deleuze's use of this term, I have used the term ideas with reference to Plato in some contexts where standard English translations would use forms. Secondly, in the pursuit of his own distinctive style of philosophizing which combines an extreme sobriety in the use of language with an extraordinary vitality in the use of concepts, Deleuze often draws upon existing words to create a terminology for concepts of his own making. In some cases, this involves the use of technical terms taken from the sciences or particular philosophies. For example, the term multiplicity, which is now well established in the translations of Deleuze's work, is derived from the French mathematical term, multiplicite, used to refer to those Riemannian objects which English mathematicians would call manifolds. In other cases, Deleuze employs apparently ordinary words to designate important concepts of his own making. This is true of point remarquable, which I have rendered as distinctive point. This term has been variously translated as prominent, exceptional or remarkable point. In fact, there is nothing remarkable about these points, they are the points or pre-individual singularities which distinguish one idea, problem or multiplicity from another. Initially introduced alongside the mathematical concept of singular point, which is employed to designate those points which characterize or define a given function. Distinctive point takes on a life of its own as a non-mathematical term of art in Deleuze's work. It is not to be confused with the distinctive traits referred to by structural linguistics. Nor should it be confused with the shining points to which Bergson refers in his discussion of memory, although in this book and in Bergsonism Deleuze does establish a connection between these two terms. A further difficulty arises in cases where a single word in French has multiple English equivalents. A frequently occurring word of this type is moi, which may be rendered either as ego or as self. Here, the attempt to follow standard English terminology has led me to use self in all contexts except those where it is explicitly a question of psychoanalysis, in which case I have used ego. In this case, readers should be aware that I have maintained continuity with the existing English terminology for particular philosophies, at the cost of introducing a discontinuity into Deleuze's text which is not present in the original. Another case of this type is the word fond, which may be either ground or bottom. This term occurs widely in conjunction and opposition with a series of cognate French words, fond, fondement, fondation, as well as the important term sans fond and Deleuze's own effondement. I have retained Deleuze's distinction between foundation, and ground, fondement. However, while the French fonder often occurs in contexts in which the appropriate English term would be the verb to found, I have mostly preferred ground in order to maintain the connection with Deleuze's important usage of le fond and fondement. Both these terms are connected with the philosophical concept which is regularly rendered as ground in English translations of German philosophy, while his notion of the groundless, sans fond, is explicitly linked to the German ungrund. For this reason, I have also used ungrounding for effondment. This family of terms is further complicated by the occasional play upon fond, bottom or depths, and profound, deep, profound. However, since Deleuze contrasts the concept of depth, profonder, with that of ground, fond, in Chapter 5, I have used ground for la fond throughout. Additional translators' notes on particular points, along with references to texts cited, have been included in the notes. These are indicated by an asterisk. Many colleagues have read sections, offered assistance or answered my queries in the course of preparing this translation. In particular, I would like to thank Genevieve Lloyd, Paul Crittenden, Kim Lygos and Paul Thorne for their scholarly assistance, the Dean, Richard Campbell, and the Faculty of Arts at the Australian National University for awarding me a Faculty Research Fund grant, Rex Butler for his considerable efforts as research assistant and reader, Hugh Tomlinson, who suggested that I undertake this task, Constantin V. Bounders, who sent me his draft translation of the entire text, thereby providing me with an invaluable means of checking the accuracy of my own, Martin Jorfin, Timothy S. Murphy and Amitavo Islam for their comments, and Brian Masumi for his scrupulous and helpful reader's review. I am grateful to Peter Cook for his help with proofreading and printing the final text, and with compiling the index. Throughout the course of this project, I have been fortunate to enjoy the support, encouragement and scholarly assistance of Moira Gatens. Preface to the English edition. There is a great difference between writing history of philosophy and writing philosophy. In the one case, we study the arrows or the tools of a great thinker, the trophies and the prey, the continents discovered. In the other case, we trim our own arrows, or gather those which seem to us the finest in order to try to send them in other directions, even if the distance covered is not astronomical but relatively small. We try to speak in our own name only to learn that a proper name designates no more than the outcome of a body of work, in other words, the concepts discovered, on condition that we were able to express these and imbue them with life using all the possibilities of language. After I had studied Hume, Spinoza, Nietzsche and Proust, all of whom fired me with enthusiasm, Difference and Repetition was the first book in which I tried to do philosophy. All that I have done since is connected to this book, including what I wrote with Guattari. Obviously, I speak from my own point of view. It is very difficult to say why one becomes attached to a particular problem, why was it difference and repetition which preoccupied me rather than something else, and why the two together rather than separately. These were not exactly new problems, since the history of philosophy, and especially contemporary philosophy, dealt with them constantly. But perhaps the majority of philosophers had subordinated difference to identity or to the same, to the similar, to the opposed or to the analogous. They had introduced difference into the identity of the concept, they had put difference in the concept itself, thereby reaching a conceptual difference, but not a concept of difference. We tend to subordinate difference to identity in order to think it, from the point of view of the concept or the subject. For example, specific difference presupposes an identical concept in the form of a genus. We also have a tendency to subordinate it to resemblance, from the point of view of perception, to opposition, from the point of view of predicates, and to analogy, from the point of view of judgment. In other words, we do not think difference in itself. With Aristotle, philosophy was able to provide itself with an organic representation of difference. With Leibniz and Hegel an orgiastic representation, it has not, for all that, reached difference in itself. The situation was perhaps no better with regard to repetition. In another manner, this too is thought in terms of the identical, the similar, the equal or the opposed. In this case, we treat it as a difference without concept. Two things repeat one another when they are different even while they have exactly the same concept. Henceforth, everything which causes repetition to vary seems to us to cover or hide it at the same time. Here again, we do not reach a concept of repetition. By contrast, might we not form such a concept once we realize that variation is not added to repetition in order to hide it, but is rather its condition or constitutive element, the interiority of repetition par excellence? Disguise no less than displacement forms part of repetition, and of difference, a common transport or diaphora. At the limit, might there not be a single power of difference or of repetition, but one which operates only in the multiple and determines multiplicities? Every philosophy must achieve its own manner of speaking about the arts and sciences, as though it established alliances with them. It is very difficult, since philosophy obviously cannot claim the least superiority, but also creates and expounds its own concepts only in relation to what it can grasp of scientific functions and artistic constructions. A philosophical concept can never be confused with a scientific function or an artistic construction, but finds itself in affinity with these in this or that domain of science or style of art. The scientific or artistic content of a philosophy may be very elementary, since it is not obliged to advance art or science, but it can advance itself only by forming properly philosophical concepts from a given function or construction, however elementary. Philosophy cannot be undertaken independently of science or art. It is in this sense that we tried to constitute a philosophical concept from the mathematical function of differentiation and the biological function of differentiation, in asking whether there was not a statable relation between these two concepts which could not appear at the level of their respective objects. Art, science and philosophy seemed to us to be caught up in mobile relations in which each is obliged to respond to the other, but by its own means. Finally, in this book it seemed to me that the powers of difference and repetition could be reached only by putting into question the traditional image of thought. By this I mean not only that we think according to a given method, but also that there is a more or less implicit, tacit or presupposed image of thought which determines our goals when we try to think. For example, we suppose that thought possesses a good nature, and the thinker a good will, naturally to want the true. We take as a model the process of recognition, in her words, a common sense or employment of all the faculties on a supposed same object. We designate error, nothing but error, as the enemy to be fought, and we suppose that the true concerns solutions, in other words, propositions capable of serving as answers. This is the classic image of thought, and as long as the critique has not been carried to the heart of that image it is difficult to conceive of thought as encompassing those problems which point beyond the propositional mode, or as involving encounters which escape all recognition, or as confronting its true enemies, which are quite different from thought, or as attaining that which steers thought from its natural torpor and notorious bad will, and forces us to think. A new image of thought, or rather, a liberation of thought from those images which imprison it, this is what I had already sought to discover in Proust. Here, however, in difference and repetition, this search is autonomous and it becomes the condition for the discovery of these two concepts. It is therefore the third chapter which now seems to me the most necessary and the most concrete, and which serves to introduce subsequent books up to and including the research undertaken with Guattari where we invoked a vegetal model of thought, the rhizome in opposition to the tree, a rhizome thought instead of an arborescent thought. Preface. The weaknesses of a book are often the counterparts of empty intentions that one did not know how to implement. In this sense, a declaration of intent is evidence of real modesty in relation to the ideal book. It is often said that prefaces should be read only at the end. Conversely, conclusions should be read at the outset. This is true of the present book, the conclusion of which could make reading the rest unnecessary. The subject dealt with here is manifestly in the air. The signs may be noted: Heidegger's more and more pronounced orientation towards a philosophy of ontological difference, the structuralist project, based upon a distribution of differential characters within a space of coexistence. The contemporary novelist's art which revolves around difference and repetition, not only in its most abstract reflections but also in its effective techniques, the discovery in a variety of fields of a power peculiar to repetition, a power which also inhabits the unconscious, language and art. All these signs may be attributed to a generalized anti-Hegelianism. Difference and repetition have taken the place of the identical and the negative, of identity and contradiction. For difference implies the negative, and allows itself to lead to contradiction, only to the extent that its subordination to the identical is maintained. The primacy of identity, however conceived, defines the world of representation. But modern thought is born of the failure of representation, of the loss of identities, and of the discovery of all the forces that act under the representation of the identical. The modern world is one of simulacra. Man did not survive God, nor did the identity of the subject survive that of substance. All identities are only simulated, produced as an optical effect by the more profound game of difference and repetition. We propose to think difference in itself independently of the forms of representation which reduce it to the same, and the relation of different to different independently of those forms which make them pass through the negative. Modern life is such that, confronted with the most mechanical, the most stereotypical repetitions, inside and outside ourselves, we endlessly extract from them little differences, variations and modifications. Conversely, secret, disguised and hidden repetitions, animated by the perpetual displacement of a difference, restore bare, mechanical and stereotypical repetitions, within and without us. In simulacra, repetition already plays upon repetitions, and difference already plays upon differences. Repetitions repeat themselves, while the differentiator differentiates itself. The task of life is to make all these repetitions coexist in a space in which difference is distributed. Two lines of research lie at the origin of this book. One concerns a concept of difference without negation, precisely because unless it is subordinated to the identical, difference would not extend or would not have to extend as far as opposition and contradiction. The other concerns a concept of repetition in which physical, mechanical or bare repetitions, repetition of the same, would find their raison d'etre in the more profound structures of a hidden repetition in which a differential is disguised and displaced. These two lines of research spontaneously came together, because on every occasion these concepts of a pure difference and a complex repetition seemed to connect and coalesce. The perpetual divergence and decentering of difference corresponded closely to a displacement and a disguising within repetition. There are certainly many dangers in invoking pure differences which have become independent of the negative and liberated from the identical. The greatest danger is that of lapsing into the representations of a beautiful soul. There are only reconcilable and federative differences, far removed from bloody struggles. The beautiful soul says, we are different, but not opposed. The notion of a problem, which we see linked to that of difference, also seems to nurture the sentiments of the beautiful soul. Only problems and questions matter. Nevertheless, we believe that when these problems attain their proper degree of positivity, and when difference becomes the object of a corresponding affirmation, they release a power of aggression and selection which destroys the beautiful soul by depriving it of its very identity and breaking its goodwill. The problematic and the differential determine struggles or destructions in relation to which those of the negative are only appearances, and the wishes of the beautiful soul are so many mystifications trapped in appearances. The simulacrum is not just a copy, but that which overturns all copies by also overturning the models. Every thought becomes an aggression. A book of philosophy should be in part a very particular species of detective novel, in part a kind of science fiction. By detective novel we mean that concepts, with their zones of presence, should intervene to resolve local situations. They themselves change along with the problems. They have spheres of influence where, as we shall see, they operate in relation to dramas and by means of a certain cruelty. They must have a coherence among themselves, but that coherence must not come from themselves. They must receive their coherence from elsewhere. This is the secret of empiricism. Empiricism is by no means a reaction against concepts, nor a simple appeal to lived experience. On the contrary, it undertakes the most insane creation of concepts ever seen or heard. Empiricism is a mysticism and a mathematicism of concepts, but precisely one which treats the concept as object of an encounter, as a here and now, or rather as a near-hun from which emerge inexhaustibly ever new, differently distributed heres and nows. Only an empiricist could say, concepts are indeed things, but things in their free and wild state, beyond anthropological predicates. I make, remake and unmake my concepts along a moving horizon, from an always discentered center, from an always displaced periphery which repeats and differentiates them. The task of modern philosophy is to overcome the alternatives temporal and non-temporal, historicoidal and particular, universal. Following Nietzsche we discover, as more profound than time and eternity, the untimely. Philosophy is neither a philosophy of history, nor a philosophy of the eternal, but untimely, always and only untimely, that is to say, acting counter to our time and thereby acting on our time and, let us hope, for the benefit of a time to come. Following Samuel Butler, we discover Rehan, signifying at once the originary nowhere and the displaced, disguised, modified and always recreated here and now. Neither empirical particularities nor abstract universals, a cogito for a dissolved self. We believe in a world in which individuations are impersonal, and singularities are pre-individual, the splendor of the pronoun one whence the science fiction aspect, which necessarily derives from this eon. What this book should therefore have made apparent is the advent of a coherence which is no more our own, that of mankind, than that of God or the world. In this sense, it should have been an apocalyptic book, the third time in the series of times. Science fiction in yet another sense, one in which the weaknesses become manifest. How else can one write but of those things which one doesn't know, or knows badly? It is precisely that we imagine having something to say. We write only at the frontiers of our knowledge, at the border which separates our knowledge from our ignorance and transforms the one into the other. Only in this manner are we resolved to write. To satisfy ignorance is to put off writing until tomorrow, or rather, to make it impossible. Perhaps writing has a relation to silence altogether more threatening than that which it is supposed to entertain with death. We are therefore well aware, unfortunately, that we have spoken about science in a manner which was not scientific. The time is coming when it will hardly be possible to write a book of philosophy as it has been done for so long. The old style. The search for new means of philosophical expression was begun by Nietzsche and must be pursued today in relation to the renewal of certain other arts, such as the theatre or the cinema. In this context, we can now raise the question of the utilization of the history of philosophy. It seems to us that the history of philosophy should play a role roughly analogous to that of collage in painting. The history of philosophy is the reproduction of philosophy itself. In the history of philosophy, a commentary should act as a veritable double and bear the maximal modification appropriate to a double. One imagines a philosophically bearded Hegel, a philosophically clean-shaven Marx, in the same way as a moustached Mona Lisa. It should be possible to recount a real book of past philosophy as if it were an imaginary and feigned book. Borges, we know, excelled in recounting imaginary books. But he goes further when he considers a real book, such as Don Quixote, as though it were an imaginary book, itself reproduced by an imaginary author, Pierre Menard, who in turn he considers to be real. In this case, the most exact, the most strict repetition has as its correlate the maximum of difference. The text of Cervantes and that of Menard are verbally identical, but the second is almost infinitely richer. Apostrophe. Commentaries in the history of philosophy should represent a kind of slow motion, a congelation or immobilization of the text, not only of the text to which they relate, but also of the text in which they are inserted, so much so that they have a double existence and a corresponding ideal, the pure repetition of the former text and the present text in one another. It is in order to approach this double existence that we have sometimes had to integrate historical notes into the present text. Introduction, repetition and difference. Repetition is not generality. Repetition and generality must be distinguished in several ways. Every formula which implies their confusion is regrettable. For example, when we say that two things are as alike as two drops of water, or when we identify there is only a science of the general with there is only a science of that which is repeated. Repetition and resemblance are different in kind, extremely so. Generality presents two major orders, the qualitative order of resemblances and the quantitative order of equivalences. Cycles and equalities are their respective symbols. But in any case, generality expresses a point of view according to which one term may be exchanged or substituted for another. The exchange or substitution of particulars defines our conduct in relation to generality. That is why the empiricists are not wrong to present general ideas as particular ideas in themselves, so long as they add the belief that each of these can be replaced by any other particular idea which resembles it in relation to a given word. By contrast, we can see that repetition is a necessary and justified conduct only in relation to that which cannot be replaced. Repetition as a conduct and as a point of view concerns non-exchangeable and non-substitutable singularities. Reflections, echoes, doubles and souls do not belong to the domain of resemblance or equivalence, and it is no more possible to exchange one's soul than it is to substitute real twins for one another. If exchange is the criterion of generality, theft and gift are those of repetition. There is, therefore, an economic difference between the two. To repeat is to behave in a certain manner, but in relation to something unique or singular which has no equal or equivalent. and perhaps this repetition at the level of external conduct echoes, for its own part, a more secret vibration which animates it, a more profound, internal repetition within the singular. This is the apparent paradox of festivals: they repeat an unrepeatable. They do not add a second and a third time to the first, but carry the first time to the nth power. With respect to this power, repetition interiorizes and thereby reverses itself. As Peggy says, it is not Federation Day which commemorates or represents the fall of the Bastille, but the fall of the Bastille which celebrates and repeats in advance all the Federation Days, or Monet's first water lily which repeats all the others. Generality, as generality of the particular, thus stands opposed to repetition as universality of the singular. The repetition of a work of art is like a singularity without concept, and it is not by chance that a poem must be learned by heart. The head is the organ of exchange, but the heart is the amorous organ of repetition. It is true that repetition also concerns the head, but precisely because it is its terror or paradox, Pius Servian rightly distinguished two languages: the language of science, dominated by the symbol of equality, in which each term may be replaced by others, and lyrical language, in which every term is irreplaceable and can only be repeated. Repetition can always be represented as extreme resemblance or perfect equivalence, but the fact that one can pass by degrees from one thing to another does not prevent their being different in kind. On the other hand, generality belongs to the order of laws. However, law determines only the resemblance of the subjects ruled by it, along with their equivalence to terms which it designates. Far from grounding repetition, law shows, rather, how repetition would remain impossible for pure subjects of law, particulars. It condemns them to change. As an empty form of difference, an invariable form of variation, a law compels its subjects to illustrate it only at the cost of their own change. No doubt there are as many constants as variables among the terms designated by laws, and as many permanences and perseverations as there are fluxes and variations in nature. However, a perseveration is still not a repetition. The constants of one law are in turn variables of a more general law, just as the hardest rocks become soft and fluid matter on the geological scale of millions of years. So at each level, it is in relation to large, permanent natural objects that the subject of a law experiences its own powerlessness to repeat and discovers that this powerlessness is already contained in the object, reflected in the permanent object wherein it sees itself condemned. Law unites the change of the water and the permanence of the river. Illy Fourier said of what he imbued with the utmost transitoriness those things which our gaze encounters as the most enduring, namely space and forests. This is the 18th century method. Walmer, in La Nouvelle Heloise, made a system of it, the impossibility of repetition, and change as a general condition to which all particular creatures are subject by the law of nature, were understood in relation to fixed terms, themselves, no doubt, variables in relation to other permanences and in function of other, more general laws. This is the meaning of the grove, the grotto and the sacred object. Saint Rieux learns that he cannot repeat, not only because of his own change and that of Julie, but also because of the great natural permanences, which assume a symbolic value and exclude him no less from true repetition. If repetition is possible, it is due to miracle rather than to law. It is against the law, against the similar form and the equivalent content of law. If repetition can be found, even in nature, it is in the name of a power which affirms itself against the law, which works underneath laws, perhaps superior to laws. If repetition exists, it expresses at once a singularity opposed to the general, a universality opposed to the particular, a distinctive opposed to the ordinary, an instantaneity opposed to variation and an eternity opposed to permanence. In every respect, repetition is a transgression. It puts law into question, it denounces its nominal or general character in favor of a more profound and more artistic reality. From the point of view of scientific experiment, it seems difficult to deny a relationship between repetition and law. However, we must ask under what conditions experimentation ensures repetition. Natural phenomena are produced in a free state, where any inference is possible among the vast cycles of resemblance. In this sense, everything reacts on everything else, and everything resembles everything else, resemblance of the diverse with itself. However, experimentation constitutes relatively closed environments in which phenomena are defined in terms of a small number of chosen factors, a minimum of two, for example, space and time for the movement of bodies in a vacuum. Consequently, there is no reason to question the application of mathematics to physics. Physics is already mathematical, since the closed environments or chosen factors also constitute systems of geometrical coordinates. In these conditions, phenomena necessarily appear as equal to a certain quantitative relation between the chosen factors. Experimentation is thus a matter of substituting one order of generality for another, an order of equality for an order of resemblance. Resemblances are unpacked in order to discover an equality which allows the identification of a phenomenon under the particular conditions of the experiment. Repetition appears here only in the passage from one order of generality to another, emerging with the help of, or on the occasion of, this passage. It is as if repetition momentarily appeared between or underneath the two generalities. Here too, however, there is a risk of mistaking a difference in kind for a difference of degree. For generality only represents and presupposes a hypothetical repetition. Given the same circumstances, then, this formula says that in similar situations one will always be able to select and retain the same factors, which represent the being equal of the phenomena. This, however, does not account for what gives rise to repetition, nor for what is categorical or important for repetition in principle. What is important in principle is n times as the power of a single time, without the need to pass through a second or a third time. In its essence, repetition refers to a singular power which differs in kind from generality, even when, in order to appear, it takes advantage of the artificial passage from one order of generality to another. Expecting repetition from the law of nature is the Stoic error. The wise must be converted into the virtuous. The dream of finding a law which would make repetition possible passes over to the moral sphere. There is always a task to recommence, a fidelity to be revived within a daily life indistinguishable from the reaffirmation of duty. Buchner makes Danton say, "It is so wearisome. First you put on your shirt, then your trousers, you drag yourself into bed at night and in the morning drag yourself out again, and always you put one foot in front of the other. There is little hope that it will ever change. Millions have always done it like that and millions more will do so after us. Moreover, since we're made up of two halves which both do the same thing, everything's done twice. It's all very boring and very, very sad." However, what good is moral law if it does not sanctify reiteration, above all if it does not make reiteration possible and give us a legislative power from which we are excluded by the law of nature? Moralists sometimes present the categories of good and evil in the following manner: every time we try to repeat according to nature or as natural beings, repetition of a pleasure, of a past, of a passion, we throw ourselves into a demonic and already damned exercise which can end only in despair or boredom. The good, by contrast, holds out the possibility of repetition, of successful repetition and of the spirituality of repetition, because it depends not upon a law of nature but on the law of duty, of which, as moral beings, we cannot be subjects without also being legislators. What is Kant's highest test if not a criterion which should decide what can in principle be reproduced? In other words, what can be repeated without contradiction in the form of moral law? The man of duty invented a test of repetition. He decided what in principle could be repeated. He thought he had thereby defeated both the demonic and the wearisome. Moreover, as an echo of Danton's concerns or a response to them, is there not a moralism in that repetition apparatus described with such precision by Kant's biographers, right down to the astonishing garters that he made for himself, and the regularity of his daily promenades, in the sense that neglecting one's toilet and missing exercise are among those conducts whose maxim cannot, without contradiction, be regarded as a universal law, nor, therefore, be the object of rightful repetition? Conscience, however, suffers from the following ambiguity: it can be conceived only by supposing the moral law to be external, superior and indifferent to the natural law, but the application of the moral law can be conceived only by restoring to conscience itself the image and the model of the law of nature. As a result, the moral law, far from giving us true repetition, still leaves us in generality. This time, the generality is not that of nature but that of habit as a second nature. It is useless to point to the existence of immoral or bad habits. It is the form of habit, or, as Bergson used to say, the habit of acquiring habits, the whole of obligation, which is essentially moral or has the form of the good. Furthermore, in this whole or generality of habit we again find the two major orders, that of resemblance, in the variable conformity of the elements of action with a given model insofar as their habit has not been acquired, and that of equivalence, with the equality of the elements of action in different situations once the habit has been acquired. As a result, habit never gives rise to true repetition. Sometimes the action changes and is perfected while the intention remains constant, sometimes the action remains the same in different contexts and with different intentions. There again, if repetition is possible, it would appear only between or beneath the two generalities of perfection and integration, testifying to the presence of a quite different power, at the risk of overturning these two generalities. If repetition is possible, it is as much opposed to moral law as it is to natural law. There are two known ways to overturn moral law. One is by ascending towards the principles, challenging the law as secondary, derived, borrowed or general, denouncing it as involving a second-hand principle which diverts an original force or usurps an original power. The other way, by contrast, is to overturn the law by descending towards the consequences, to which one submits with a too perfect attention to detail. By adopting the law, a falsely submissive soul manages to evade it and to taste pleasures it was supposed to forbid. We can see this in demonstration by absurdity and working to rule, but also in some forms of masochistic behavior which mock by submission. The first way of overturning the law is ironic, where irony appears as an art of principles, of ascent towards the principles and of overturning principles. The second is humor, which is an art of consequences and descents, of suspensions and falls. Must we understand that repetition appears in both this suspense and this ascent, as though existence recommenced and reiterated itself once it is no longer constrained by laws? Repetition belongs to humor and irony, it is by nature transgression or exception, always revealing a singularity opposed to the particulars subsumed under laws, a universal opposed to the generalities which give rise to laws. There is a force common to Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. I would have to be added in order to form the triptych of priest, antichrist and Catholic. Each of the three, in his own way, makes repetition not only a power peculiar to language and thought, a superior pathos and pathology, but also the fundamental category of a philosophy of the future. To each corresponds a testament as well as a theatre, a conception of the theatre, and a hero of repetition as a principal character in this theatre, Job Abraham, Dionysus, Zarathustra, Joan of Arc. What separates them is considerable, evident and well known. But nothing can hide this prodigious encounter in relation to a philosophy of repetition. They oppose repetition to all forms of generality. Nor do they take the word repetition in a metaphorical sense, on the contrary, they have a way of taking it literally and of introducing it into their style. We can, or rather, must, first of all list the principal propositions which indicate the points on which they coincide. 1. Make something new of repetition itself, connect it with a test, with a selection or selective test, make it the supreme object of the will and of freedom. Kierkegaard specifies that it is not a matter of drawing something new from repetition, of extracting something new from it. Only contemplation or the mind which contemplates from without extracts. It is rather a matter of acting, of making repetition as such a novelty, that is, a freedom and a task of freedom. In the case of Nietzsche, liberate the will from everything which binds it by making repetition the very object of willing. No doubt it is repetition which already binds, but if we die of repetition we are also saved and healed by it, healed, above all, by the other repetition. The whole mystical game of loss and salvation is therefore contained in repetition, along with the whole theatrical game of life and death and the whole positive game of illness and health, cf. Zarathustra and Zarathustra convalescent by virtue of one and the same power which is that of repetition in the eternal return. 2. In consequence, oppose repetition to the laws of nature. Kierkegaard declares that he does not speak at all of repetition in nature, of cycles and seasons, exchanges and equalities. Furthermore, if repetition concerns the most interior element of the will, this is because everything changes around the will, in accordance with the law of nature. According to the law of nature, repetition is impossible. For this reason, Kierkegaard condemns as aesthetic repetition every attempt to obtain repetition from the laws of nature by identifying with the legislative principle, whether in the Epicurean or the Stoic manner. It will be said that the situation is not so clear with Nietzsche. Nietzsche's declarations are nevertheless explicit. If he discovers repetition in the physis itself, this is because he discovers in the physis something superior to the reign of laws, a will willing itself through all change, a power opposed to law, an interior of the earth opposed to the laws of its surface. Nietzsche opposes his hypothesis to the cyclical hypothesis. He conceives of repetition in the eternal return as being, but he opposes this being to every legal form, to the being similar as much as to the being equal. How could the thinker who goes furthest in criticizing the notion of law reintroduce eternal return as a law of nature? How could such a connoisseur of the Greeks be justified in regarding his own thought as prodigious and new, if he were content to formulate that natural platitude, that generality regarding nature well known to the ancients? On 2 occasions, Zarathustra corrects erroneous interpretations of the eternal return, with anger, directed at his demon, spirit of gravity. Do not treat this too lightly, with kindness, directed at his animals, 0 buffoons and barrel organs. You have already made a refrain out of it. The refrain is the eternal return as cycle or circulation, as being similar and being equal, in short, as natural animal certitude and as sensible law of nature. 3. Oppose repetition to moral law, to the point where it becomes the suspension of ethics, a thought beyond good and evil. Repetition appears as the logos of the solitary and the singular, the logos of the private thinker. Both Kierkegaard and Nietzsche develop the opposition between the private thinker, the thinker comet and bearer of repetition, and the public professor and doctor of law, whose second-hand discourse proceeds by mediation and finds its moralizing source in the generality of concepts, cf. Kierkegaard against Hegel, Nietzsche against Kant and Hegel, and from this point of view, Hegel against the Sorbonne. Job is infinite contestation and Abraham infinite resignation, but these are one and the same thing. Job challenges the law in an ironic manner, refusing all second-hand explanations and dismissing the general in order to reach the most singular as principle or as universal. Abraham submits humorously to the law, but finds in that submission precisely the singularity of his only son whom the law commanded him to sacrifice. As Kierkegaard understands it, repetition is the transcendent correlate shared by the psychical intentions of contestation and resignation. We rediscover the two aspects in Hegel's doubling of Joan of Arc and Gervaise, in Nietzsche's striking atheism, hatred of the law and amor fati, love of fate, aggression and acquiescence are the two faces of Zarathustra, gathered from the Bible and turned back against it. Further, in a certain sense one can see Zarathustra's moral test of repetition as competing with Kant. The eternal return says, whatever you will it in such a manner that you also will its eternal return. There is a formalism here which overturns Kant on his own ground, a test which goes further since, instead of relating repetition to a supposed moral law, it seems to make repetition itself the only form of a law beyond morality. In reality, however, things are even more complicated. The form of repetition in the eternal return is the brutal form of the immediate, that of the universal and the singular reunited, which dethrones every general law, dissolves the mediations and annihilates the particulars subjected to the law. Just as irony and black humor are combined in Zarathustra, so there is a within the law and a beyond the law united in the eternal return. 4. Oppose repetition not only to the generalities of habit but also to the particularities of memory. For it is perhaps habit which manages to draw something new from a repetition contemplated from without. With habit, we act only on the condition that there is a little self within us which contemplates, it is this which extracts the new, in other words, the general, from the pseudo-repetition of particular cases. Memory, then, perhaps recovers the particulars dissolved in generality. These psychological movements are of little consequence, for both Nietzsche and Kierkegaard they fade away in the face of repetition proposed as the double condemnation of habit and memory. In this way, repetition is the thought of the future, it is opposed to both the ancient category of reminiscence and the modern category of habitus. It is in repetition and by repetition that forgetting becomes a positive power while the unconscious becomes a positive and superior unconscious. For example, forgetting as a force is an integral part of the lived experience of eternal return. Everything is summed up in power. When Kierkegaard speaks of repetition as the second power of consciousness, second means not a second time but the infinite which belongs to a single time, the eternity which belongs to an instant, the unconscious which belongs to consciousness, the nth power. And when Nietzsche presents the eternal return as the immediate expression of the will to power does not at all mean to want power but, on the contrary, whatever you will, carry it to the nth power, in other words, separate out the superior form by virtue of the selective operation of thought in the eternal return, by virtue of the singularity of repetition in the eternal return itself. Here, in the superior form of everything that is, we find the immediate identity of the eternal return and the overman. We are not suggesting any resemblance whatsoever between Nietzsche's Dionysus and Kierkegaard's God. On the contrary, we believe that the difference is insurmountable. But this is all the more reason to ask why their coincidence concerning this fundamental objective, the theme of repetition, even though they understand this objective differently. Kierkegaard and Nietzsche are among those who bring to philosophy new means of expression. In relation to them we speak readily of an overcoming of philosophy. Furthermore, in all their work, movement is at issue. Their objection to Hegel is that he does not go beyond false movement, in other words, the abstract logical movement of mediation. They want to put metaphysics in motion, in action. They want to make it act, and make it carry out immediate acts. It is not enough, therefore, for them to propose a new representation of movement. Representation is already mediation. Rather, it is a question of producing within the work a movement capable of affecting the mind outside of all representation. It is a question of making movement itself a work, without interposition, of substituting direct signs for mediate representations, of inventing vibrations, rotations, whirlings, gravitations, dances or leaps which directly touch the mind. This is the idea of a man of the theatre, the idea of a director before his time. In this sense, something completely new begins with Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. They no longer reflect on the theatre in the Hegelian manner. Neither do they set up a philosophical theatre. They invent an incredible equivalent of theatre within philosophy, thereby founding simultaneously this theatre of the future and a new philosophy. It will be said that, at least from the point of view of theatre, there was no production, neither the profession of priest and Copenhagen around 1840, nor the break with Wagner and Bayreuth, was a favourable condition. One thing, however, is certain: when Kierkegaard speaks of ancient theatre and modern drama, the environment has already changed. We are no longer in the element of reflection. We find here a thinker who lives the problem of masks, who experiences the inner emptiness of masks and seeks to fill it, to complete it, albeit with the absolutely different, that is, by putting into it all the difference between the finite and the infinite, thereby creating the idea of a theatre of humour and of faith. When Kierkegaard explains that the knight of faith so resembles a bourgeois in his Sunday best as to be capable of being mistaken for one, this philosophical instruction must be taken as the remark of a director showing how the knight of faith should be played. And when he comments on Job or Abraham, when he imagines the variations of Agnes and the Triton, he rewrites the tale in a manner which is clearly that of a scenario. Mozart's music resonates even in Abraham and Job. It is a matter of leaping to the tune of this music. I look only at movements is the language of a director who poses the highest theatrical problem, the problem of a movement which would directly touch the soul, which would be that of the soul. Even more so with Nietzsche. The birth of tragedy is not a reflection on ancient theatre so much as the practical foundation of a theatre of the future, the opening up of a path along which Nietzsche still thinks it possible to push Wagner. The break with Wagner is not a matter of theory, nor of music. It concerns the respective roles of text, history, noise, music, light, song, dance and decor in this theatre of which Nietzsche dreams. Zarathustra incorporates the two attempts at dramatizing empedocles. Moreover, if Bizet is better than Wagner, it is from the point of view of theatre and for Zarathustra as dances. Nietzsche's reproach to Wagner is that he inverted and distorted movement, giving us a nautical theatre in which we must paddle and swim rather than one in which we can walk and dance. Zarathustra is conceived entirely within philosophy, but also entirely for the stage. Everything in it is scored and visualized, put in motion and made to walk or dance. How can it be read without searching for the exact sound of the cries of the higher man? How can the prologue be read without staging the episode of the tightrope walker which opens the whole story? At certain moments, it is a comic opera about terrible things, and it is not by chance that Nietzsche speaks of the comic character of the overman. Remember the song of Ariadne from the mouth of the old sorcerer. Here, two masks are superimposed, that of a young woman, almost of a cur, which has just been laid over the mask of a repugnant old man. The actor must play the role of an old man playing the role of the cur. Here too, for Nietzsche, it is a matter of filling the inner emptiness of the mask within a theatrical space, by multiplying the superimposed masks and inscribing the omnipresence of Dionysus in that superimposition, by inserting both the infinity of real movement and the form of the absolute difference given in the repetition of eternal return. When Nietzsche says that the overman resembles Borgia rather than Parsifal, or when he suggests that the overman belongs at once to both the Jesuit order and the Prussian officer corps, we can understand these texts only by taking them for what they are, the remarks of a director indicating how the overman should be played. Theatre is real movement, and it extracts real movement from all the arts it employs. This is what we are told: this movement, the essence and the interiority of movement, is not opposition, not mediation, but repetition. Hegel is denounced as the one who proposes an abstract movement of concepts instead of a movement of the physis and the psyche. Hegel substitutes the abstract relation of the particular to the concept in general for the true relation of the singular and the universal in the idea. He thus remains in the reflected element of representation, within simple generality. He represents concepts instead of dramatizing ideas. He creates a false theatre, a false drama, a false movement. We must see how Hegel betrays and distorts the immediate in order to ground his dialectic in that incomprehension, and to introduce mediation in a movement which is no more than that of his own thought and its generalities. When we say, on the contrary, that movement is repetition and that this is our true theatre, we are not speaking of the effort of the actor who repeats because he has not yet learned the part. We have in mind the theatrical space, the emptiness of that space, and the manner in which it is filled and determined by the signs and masks through which the actor plays a role which plays other roles. We think of how repetition is woven from one distinctive point to another, including the differences within itself. When Marx also criticizes the abstract false movement or mediation of the Hegelians, he finds himself drawn to an idea, which he indicates rather than develops, an essentially theatrical idea, to the extent that history is theatre, then repetition, along with the tragic and the comic within repetition, forms a condition of movement under which the actors or the heroes produce something effectively new in history. The theatre of repetition is opposed to the theatre of representation, just as movement is opposed to the concept and to representation which refers it back to the concept. In the theatre of repetition, we experience pure forces, dynamic lines in space which act without intermediary upon the spirit, and link it directly with nature and history, with a language which speaks before words, with gestures which develop before organized bodies, with masks before faces, with spectres and phantoms before characters. The whole apparatus of repetition has a terrible power. It then becomes easy to speak of the differences between Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. Even this question, however, must no longer be posed at the speculative level of the ultimate nature of the God of Abraham or the Dionysus of Zarathustra. It is rather a matter of knowing what it means to produce movement, to repeat or to obtain repetition. Is it a matter of leaping, as Kierkegaard believes? Or is it rather a matter of dancing, as Nietzsche thinks? He does not like the confusion of dancing and leap in section. Only Zarathustra is ape, his demon, his dwarf, his buffoon, leaps. Kierkegaard offers us a theatre of faith. He opposes spiritual movement, the movement of faith, to logical movement. He can thus invite us to go beyond all aesthetic repetition, beyond irony and even humour, all the while painfully aware that he offers us only the aesthetic, ironic and humoristic image of such a going beyond. With Nietzsche, it is a theatre of unbelief, of movement as physis, already a theatre of cruelty. Here, humour and irony are indispensable and fundamental operations of nature. And what would eternal return be, if we forgot that it is a vertiginous movement endowed with a force, not one which causes the return of the same in general, but one which selects, one which expels as well as creates, destroys as well as produces. Nietzsche's leading idea is to ground the repetition in eternal return on both the death of God and the dissolution of the self. However, it is a quite different alliance in the theatre of faith. Kierkegaard dreams of an alliance between a God and a self rediscovered. All sorts of differences follow. Is the movement in the sphere of the mind, or in the entrails of the earth which knows neither God nor self? Where will it be better protected against generalities, against mediations? Is repetition supernatural, to the extent that it is over and above the laws of nature? Or is it rather the most natural will of nature in itself and willing itself as physis, because nature is by itself superior to its own kingdoms and its own laws? Has Kierkegaard not mixed all kinds of things together in his condemnation of aesthetic repetition, a pseudo-repetition attributable to general laws of nature and a true repetition in nature itself, a pathological repetition of the passions and a repetition in art and the work of art? We cannot now resolve any of these problems. It has been enough for us to find theatrical confirmation of an irreducible difference between generality and repetition. Repetition and generality are opposed from the point of view of conduct and from the point of view of law. It remains to specify a third opposition from the point of view of concepts or representation. Let us pose a question quid juris. A concept may be in principle the concept of a particular existing thing, thus having an infinite comprehension. Infinite comprehension is the correlate of an extension equals 1. It is very important that this infinity of comprehension be supposed actual, not virtual or simply indefinite. It is on this condition that predicates in the form of moments of concepts are preserved, and have an effect on the subject to which they are attributed. Infinite comprehension thus makes possible remembering and recognition, memory and self-consciousness, even when these two faculties are not themselves infinite. The relation of a concept to its object under this double aspect, in the form that it assumes in this memory and this self-consciousness, is called representation. From this may be drawn the principles of a vulgarized Leibnizianism. According to a principle of difference, every determination is conceptual in the last instance, or actually belongs to the comprehension of a concept. According to a principle of sufficient reason, there is always one concept per particular thing. According to the reciprocal principle of the identity of indiscernibles, there is one and only one thing per concept. Together, these principles expound a theory of difference as conceptual difference, or develop the account of representation as mediation. However, a concept can always be blocked at the level of each of its determinations or each of the predicates that it includes. Insofar as it serves as a determination, a predicate must remain fixed in the concept while becoming something else in the thing. Animal becomes something other in man and in horse, humanity something other in Peter and in Paul. This is why the comprehension of the concept is infinite. Having become mother in the thing, the predicate is like the object of another predicate in the concept. But this is also why each determination remains general or defines a resemblance, to the extent that it remains fixed in the concept and applicable by right to an infinity of things. Here, the concept is thus constituted in such a fashion that, in its real use, its comprehension extends to infinity, but in its logical use, this comprehension is always liable to an artificial blockage. Every logical imitation of the comprehension of a concept endows it with an extension greater than one, in principle infinite, and thus of a generality such that no existing individual can correspond to it et nunc, rule of the inverse relation of comprehension and extension. Thus, the principle of difference understood as difference in the concept does not oppose but, on the contrary, allows the greatest space possible for the apprehension of resemblances. Even from the point of view of conundrums, the question what difference is there? May always be transformed into, what resemblance is there? But above all, in classification, the determination of species implies and supposes a continual evaluation of resemblances. Undoubtedly, resemblance is not a partial identity, but that is only because the predicate in the concept is not, by virtue of its becoming other in the thing, a part of that thing. We wish to indicate the difference between this type of artificial blockage and a quite different type which must be called a natural blockage of the concept. One refers to logic pure and simple, but the other refers to a transcendental logic or a dialectic of existence. Let us suppose that a concept, taken at a particular moment when its comprehension is finite, is forcibly assigned a place in space and time, that is, an existence corresponding normally to the extension equals 1. We would say, then, that a genus or species passes into existence et nunc without any augmentation of comprehension. There is a rift between that extension equals 1 imposed upon the concept and the extension equals infinity, that its weak comprehension demands in principle. The result will be a discrete extension, that is, a pullulation of individuals absolutely identical in respect of their concept, and participating in the same singularity in existence, the paradox of doubles or twins. This phenomenon of discrete extension implies a natural blockage of the concept, different in kind from a logical blockage. It forms a true repetition in existence rather than an order of resemblance in thought. There is a significant difference between generality, which always designates a logical power of concepts, and repetition, which testifies to their powerlessness or their real limits. Repetition is the pure fact of a concept with finite comprehension being forced to pass as such into existence. Can we find examples of such a passage? Epicurean atoms would be one. Individuals localized in space, they nevertheless have a meager comprehension, which is made up for in discrete extension, to the point where there exists an infinity of atoms of the same shape and size. The existence of Epicurean atoms may be doubted. On the other hand, the existence of words, which are in a sense linguistic atoms, cannot be doubted. Words possess a comprehension which is necessarily finite, since they are by nature the objects of a merely nominal definition. We have here a reason why the comprehension of the concept cannot extend to infinity. We define a word by only a finite number of words. Nevertheless, speech and writing, from which words are inseparable, give them an existence et nunc. A genus thereby passes into existence as such, and here again extension is made up for in dispersion, in discreteness, under the sign of a repetition which forms the real power of language in speech and writing. The question is, are there other natural blockages besides those of discrete extension and finite comprehension? Let us assume a concept with indefinite comprehension, virtually infinite. However far one pursues that comprehension, one can always think that it subsumes perfectly identical objects. By contrast with the actual infinite, where the concept is sufficient by right to distinguish its object from every other object, in this case the concept can pursue its comprehension indefinitely, always subsuming a plurality of objects which is itself indefinite. Here again, the concept is the same, indefinitely the same, for objects which are distinct. We must therefore recognize the existence of non-conceptual differences between these objects. It is Kant who best indicates the correlation between objects endowed with only an indefinite specification, and purely spatiotemporal or oppositional, non-conceptual determinations, the paradox of symmetrical objects. 8. However, these determinations are precisely only the figures of repetition. Space and time are themselves repetitive milieux, and real opposition is not a maximum of difference but a minimum of repetition, a repetition reduced to 2, echoing and returning on itself, a repetition which has found the means to define itself. Repetition thus appears as difference without a concept, repetition which escapes indefinitely continued conceptual difference. It expresses a power peculiar to the existent, a stubbornness of the existent in intuition, which resists every specification by concepts no matter how far this is taken. However far you go in the concept, Kant says, you can always repeat, that is, make several objects correspond to it, or at least 2, one for the left and one for the right, one for the more and one for the less, one for the positive and one for the negative. Such a situation may be better understood if we consider that concepts with indefinite comprehension are concepts of nature. As such, they are always in something else, they are not in nature but in the mind which contemplates it or observes it, and represents it to itself. That is why it is said that nature is alienated mind or alienated concept, opposed to itself. Corresponding to such concepts are those objects which themselves lack memory, that is, which neither possess nor collect in themselves their own moments. The question is asked why nature repeats, because it is parts extra parts, mens momentanea. Novelty then passes to the mind which represents itself, because the mind has a memory or acquires habits, it is capable of forming concepts in general and of drawing something new, of subtracting something new from the repetition that it contemplates. Concepts with finite comprehension are nominal concepts, concepts with indefinite comprehension but without memory are concepts of nature. Yet these two cases still do not exhaust the examples of natural blockage. Take an individual notion or a particular representation with infinite comprehension, endowed with memory but lacking self-consciousness. The comprehensive representation is indeed in itself, the memory is there, embracing all the particularity of an act, a scene, an event or a being. What is missing, however, for a determinate natural reason, is the for itself of consciousness or recognition. What is missing in the memory is remembrance, or rather, the working through of memory. Consciousness establishes between the I and the representation a relation much more profound than that which appears in the expression I have a representation. It relates the representation to the I as if to a free faculty which does not allow itself to be confined within any one of its products, but for which each product is already thought and recognized as past, the occasion of a determinate change in inner meaning. When the consciousness of knowledge or the working through of memory is missing, the knowledge in itself is only the repetition of its object. It is played, that is to say repeated, enacted instead of being known. Repetition here appears as the unconscious of the free concept, of knowledge or of memory, the unconscious of representation. It fell to Freud to assign the natural reason for such a blockage, repression or resistance, which makes repetition itself a veritable constraint, a compulsion. Here, then, is a third case of blockage, one which concerns, this time, the concepts of freedom. Here too, from the standpoint of a certain Freudianism, we can discover the principle of an inverse relation between repetition and consciousness, repetition and remembering, repetition and recognition, the paradox of the burials or buried objects. The less one remembers, the less one is conscious of remembering one's past. The more one re-eats it, remember and work through the memory in order not to repeat it. Self-consciousness in recognition appears as the faculty of the future or the function of the future, the function of the new. Is it not true that the only dead who return are those whom one has buried too quickly and too deeply, without paying them the necessary respects, and that remorse testifies less to an excess of memory than to a powerlessness or to a failure in the working through of a memory? There is a tragic and a comic repetition. Indeed, repetition always appears twice, once in the tragic destiny and once in the comic aspect. In the theatre, the hero repeats precisely because he is separated from an essential, infinite knowledge. This knowledge is in him, it is immersed in him and acts in him, but acts like something hidden, like a blocked representation. The difference between the comic and the tragic pertains to two elements. First, the nature of the repressed knowledge, in the one case immediate natural knowledge, a simple given of common sense, in the other terrible esoteric knowledge. Second, as a result, the manner in which the character is excluded from this knowledge, the manner in which he does not know that he knows. In general the practical problem consists in this, This unknown knowledge must be represented as veiling the whole scene, impregnating all the elements of the play and comprising in itself all the powers of mind and nature, but at the same time the hero cannot represent it to himself. On the contrary, he must enact it, play it and repeat it until the acute moment that Aristotle called recognition. At this point, repetition and representation confront one another and merge, without, however, confusing their two levels, the one reflecting itself in and being sustained by the other, the knowledge as it is represented on stage and as repeated by the actor then being recognized as the same. The discrete, the alienated and the repressed are the three cases of natural blockage, corresponding respectively to nominal concepts, concepts of nature and concepts of freedom. In all these cases, however, conceptual identity or sameness of representation is invoked to account for repetition. Repetition is attributed to elements which are really distinct but nevertheless share strictly the same concept. Repetition thus appears as a difference, but a difference absolutely without concept, in this sense, an indifferent difference. The words really, strictly, absolutely are supposed to refer to the phenomenon of natural blockage, in opposition to logical blockage which only determines a generality. However, an important drawback compromises this whole endeavor. As long as we invoke absolute conceptual identity for distinct objects, we suggest a purely negative explanation, an explanation by default. The fact that this default should be grounded in the nature of concepts or representations themselves changes nothing. In the first case, repetition occurs because nominal concepts naturally possess a finite comprehension. In the second case, repetition occurs because concepts of nature are naturally devoid of memory, alienated and outside themselves. In the third case, because the concept of freedom remains unconscious while memories and representations remain repressed. In all these cases, that which repeats does so only by dint of not comprehending, not remembering, not knowing or not being conscious. Throughout, the inadequacy of concepts and of their representative concomitants, memory and self-consciousness, remembrance and recognition, is supposed to account for repetition. Such is therefore the default of every argument grounded in the form of identity in the concept. These arguments give us only a nominal definition and a negative explanation of repetition. No doubt the formal identity which corresponds to simple logical blockage may be opposed to real identity, the same, as this appears in natural blockage. But natural blockage itself requires a positive supraconceptual force capable of explaining it, and of thereby explaining repetition. Let us return to the example of psychoanalysis. We repeat because we repress. Freud was never satisfied with such a negative schema, in which repetition is explained by amnesia. It is true that, from the beginning, repression was considered a positive power. However, he borrowed this positivity from the pleasure principle or from the reality principle. It was merely a derived positivity, one of opposition. The turning point of Freudianism appears in beyond the pleasure principle. The death instinct is discovered, not in connection with the destructive tendencies, not in connection with aggressivity, but as a result of a direct consideration of repetition phenomena. Strangely, the death instinct serves as a positive, originary principle for repetition. This is its domain and its meaning. It plays the role of a transcendental principle, whereas the pleasure principle is only psychological. For this reason, it is above all silent, not given in experience, whereas the pleasure principle is noisy. The first question, then, is, how is it that the theme of death, which appears to draw together the most negative elements of psychological life, can be in itself the most positive element, transcendently positive, to the point of affirming repetition? How can it be related to a primordial instinct? But a second question immediately arises: under what form is repetition affirmed and prescribed by the death instinct? Ultimately, it is a question of the relation between repetition and disguises. Do the disguises found in the work of dreams or symptoms, condensation, displacement, dramatization rediscover while attenuating a bare, brute repetition of the same? From the first theory of repression, Freud indicated another path. Dora elaborates her own role, and repeats her love for the father, only through other roles filled by others, which she herself adopts in relation to those others, K, Frau K, the governess. The disguises and the variations, the masks or costumes, do not come over and above. They are, on the contrary, the internal genetic elements of repetition itself, its integral and constituent parts. This path would have been able to lead the analysis of the unconscious towards a veritable theatre. However, if it did not do so, this was because Freud was unable to prevent himself maintaining the model of a brute repetition, at least as a tendency. We see this when he attributes fixation to the id, Disguise is then understood from the perspective of a simple opposition of forces. Disguised repetition is only the fruit of a secondary compromise between the opposed forces of the ego and the id. Even beyond the pleasure principle, the form of a bare repetition persists, since Freud interprets the death instinct as a tendency to return to the state of inanimate matter, one which upholds the model of a wholly physical or material repetition. Death has nothing to do with a material model. On the contrary, the death instinct may be understood in relation to masks and costumes. Repetition is truly that which disguises itself in constituting itself, that which constitutes itself only by disguising itself. It is not underneath the masks, but is formed from one mask to another, as though from one distinctive point to another, from one privileged instant to another, with and within the variations. The masks do not hide anything except other masks. There is no first term which is repeated, and even our childhood love for the mother repeats other adult loves with regard to other women, rather like the way in which the hero of In Search of Lost Time replays with his mother Swan's passion for Odette. There is therefore nothing repeated which may be isolated or abstracted from the repetition in which it was formed, but in which it is also hidden. There is no bare repetition which may be abstracted or inferred from the disguise itself. The same thing is both disguising and disguised. A decisive moment in psychoanalysis occurred when Freud gave up, in certain respects, the hypothesis of real childhood events, which would have played the part of ultimate disguised terms, in order to substitute the power of fantasy which is immersed in the death instinct, where everything is already masked and disguised. In short, repetition is in its essence symbolic. Symbols or simulacra are the letter of repetition itself. Difference is included in repetition by way of disguise and by the order of the symbol. This is why the variations do not come from without, do not express a secondary compromise between a repressing instance and a repressed instance, and must not be understood on the basis of the still negative forms of opposition, reversal or overturning. The variations express, rather, the differential mechanisms which belong to the essence and origin of that which is repeated. We should even overturn the relations between covered and uncovered within repetition. Take an uncovered or bare repetition of the same, such as an obsessional ceremony or a schizophrenic stereotype. The mechanical element in the repetition, the element of action apparently repeated, serves as a cover for a more profound repetition, which is played in another dimension, a secret verticality in which the roles and masks are furnished by the death instinct. Theatre of terror, Binswanger said of schizophrenia. There, the never seen is not the contrary of the already seen, both signify the same thing, and are lived each in the other. Nerval Sylvie already introduced us into this theatre, and the Gradiva, so close to a Nervalian inspiration, shows us the hero who lives at once both repetition as such and the repeated which is always disguised in the repetition. In the analysis of obsession, the appearance of the theme of death coincides with the moment at which the obsessed has command of all the characters of his drama and brings them together in a repetition of which the ceremony is only the external envelope. The mask, the costume, the covered is everywhere the truth of the uncovered. The mask is the true subject of repetition. Because repetition differs in kind from a representation, the repeated cannot be represented, rather, it must always be signified, masked by what signifies it, itself masking what it signifies. I do not repeat because I repress. I repress because I repeat, I forget because I repeat. I repress, because I can live certain things or certain experiences only in the mode of repetition. I am determined to repress whatever would prevent me from living them thus, in particular, the representation which mediates the lived by relating it to the form of a similar or identical object. Eros and Thanatos are distinguished in that Eros must be repeated, can be lived only through repetition, whereas Thanatos, as transcendental principle, is that which gives repetition to Eros, that which submits Eros to repetition. Only such a point of view is capable of advancing us in the obscure problems of the origin of repression, its nature, its causes and the exact terms on which it bears. For when Freud shows beyond repression properly speaking, which bears upon representations the necessity of supposing a primary repression which concerns first and foremost pure presentations, or the manner in which the drives are necessarily lived, we believe that he comes closest to a positive internal principle of repetition. This later appears to him determinable in the form of the death instinct, and it is this which, far from being explained by it, must explain the blockage of representation in repression properly speaking. This is why the law of an inverse relation between repetition and remembering is in every respect hardly satisfactory, insofar as it makes repetition depend upon repression. Freud noted from the beginning that in order to stop repeating it was not enough to remember in the abstract, without effect, nor to form a concept in general, nor even to represent the repressed event in all its particularity, it was necessary to seek out the memory there where it was, to install oneself directly in the past in order to accomplish a living connection between the knowledge and the resistance, the representation and the blockage. We are not, therefore, healed by simple anamnesis, any more than we are made ill by amnesia. Here as elsewhere, becoming conscious counts for little. The more theatrical and dramatic operation by which healing takes place, or does not take place, has a name: transference. Now transference is still repetition, above all it is repetition. If repetition makes us ill, it also heals us; if it enchains and destroys us, it also frees us, testifying in both cases to its demonic power. All cure is a voyage to the bottom of repetition. There is indeed something analogous to scientific experimentation in transference, since the patient is supposed to repeat the whole of his disturbance in privileged, artificial conditions, taking the person of the analyst as object. In transference, however, repetition does not so much serve to identify events, persons and passions as to authenticate the roles and select the masks. Transference is not an experiment but a principle which grounds the entire analytic experience. The roles themselves are by nature erotic, but the verification of these roles appeals to the highest principle and the most profound judge, the death instinct. In effect, reflection on transference was a determinant motive behind the discovery of a beyond. In this sense, repetition constitutes by itself the selective game of our illness and our health, of our loss and our salvation. How can this game be related to the death instinct? No doubt in a sense close to that in which Miller, in his wonderful book on Rimbaud, says, "I realized that I was free, that the death I had gone through had liberated me." It seems that the idea of a death instinct must be understood in terms of three paradoxical and complementary requirements: to give repetition an original, positive principle, but also an autonomous disguising power, and finally, to give it an immanent meaning in which terror is closely mingled with the movement of selection and freedom. Our problem concerns the essence of repetition. It is a question of knowing why repetition cannot be explained by the form of identity in concepts or representations, in what sense it demands a superior positive principle. This inquiry must embrace all the concepts of nature and freedom. Consider, on the border between these two cases, the repetition of a decorative motif: a figure is reproduced, while the concept remains absolutely identical. However, this is not how artists proceed in reality. They do not juxtapose instances of the figure, but rather each time combine an element of one instance with another element of a following instance. They introduce a disequilibrium into the dynamic process of construction, an instability, dissymmetry or gap of some kind which disappears only in the overall effect. Commenting on such a case, Levi Strauss writes, "These elements interlock with each other through dislocation, and it is only at the end that the pattern achieves a stability which both confirms and belies the dynamic process according to which it has been carried out." These remarks stand for the notion of causality in general. For it is not the elements of symmetry present which matter for artistic or natural causality, but those which are missing and are not in the cause. What matters is the possibility of the cause having less symmetry than the effect. Moreover, causality would remain eternally conjectural, a simple logical category, if that possibility were not at some moment or other effectively fulfilled. For this reason, the logical relation of causality is inseparable from a physical process of signaling, without which it would not be translated into action. By signal we mean a system with orders of disparate size, endowed with elements of dissymmetry. By sign we mean what happens within such a system, what flashes across the intervals when a communication takes place between disparates. The sign is indeed an effect, but an effect with two aspects. In one of these it expresses, qua sign, the productive dissymmetry, in the other it tends to cancel it. The sign is not entirely of the order of the symbol, nevertheless, it makes way for it by implying an internal difference, while leaving the conditions of its reproduction still external. The negative expression lack of symmetry should not mislead us. It indicates the origin and positivity of the causal process. It is positivity itself. For us, as the example of the decorative motif suggests, it is essential to break down the notion of causality in order to distinguish two types of repetition, one which concerns only the overall, abstract effect, and the other which concerns the acting cause. One is a static repetition, the other is dynamic. One results from the work, but the other is like the evolution of a bodily movement. One refers back to a single concept, which leaves only an external difference between the ordinary instances of a figure; the other is the repetition of an internal difference which it incorporates in each of its moments, and carries from one distinctive point to another. One could try to assimilate these two repetitions by saying that the difference between the first and the second is only a matter of a change in the content of the concept, or of the figure being articulated differently, but this would be to fail to recognize the respective order of each repetition. For in the dynamic order there is no representative concept, nor any figure represented in a pre-existing space. There is an idea, and a pure dynamism which creates a corresponding space. Studies on rhythm or symmetry confirm this duality. A distinction is drawn between arithmetic symmetry, which refers back to a scale of whole or fractional coefficients, and geometric symmetry, based upon proportions or irrational ratios, a static symmetry which is cubic or hexagonal, and a dynamic symmetry which is pentagonal and appears in a spiral line or in a geometrically progressing pulsation, in short, in a living and mortal evolution. Now, the second of these is at the heart of the first. It is the vital, positive, active procedure. In a network of double squares, we discover radiating lines which have the center of a pentagon or a pentagram as their asymmetrical pole. The network is like a fabric stretched upon a framework, but the outline, the principal rhythm of that framework, is almost always a theme independent of the network. Such elements of dissymmetry serve as both genetic principle and principle of reflection for symmetrical figures. The static repetition in the network of double squares thus refers back to a dynamic repetition, formed by a pentagon and the decreasing series of pentagrams which may be naturally inscribed therein. Similarly, the study of rhythm allows us immediately to distinguish two kinds of repetition. Cadence repetition is a regular division of time, an isochronic recurrence of identical elements. However, a period exists only insofar as it is determined by a tonic accent, commanded by intensities. Yet we would be mistaken about the function of accents if we said that they were reproduced at equal intervals. On the contrary, tonic and intensive values act by creating inequalities or incommensurabilities between metrically equivalent periods or spaces. They create distinctive points, privileged instants which always indicate a polyrhythm. Here again, the unequal is the most positive element. Cadence is only the envelope of a rhythm, and of a relation between rhythms. The reprise of points of inequality, of inflections or of rhythmic events, is more profound than the reproduction of ordinary homogeneous elements. As a result, we should distinguish cadence repetition and rhythm repetition in every case, the first being only the outward appearance or the abstract effect of the second. A bare, material repetition, repetition of the same, appears only in the sense that another repetition is disguised within it, constituting it and constituting itself in disguising itself. Even in nature, isochronic rotations are only the outward appearance of a more profound movement, the revolving cycles are only abstractions, placed together, they reveal evolutionary cycles or spirals whose principle is a variable curve, and the trajectory of which has two dissymmetrical aspects, as though it had a right and a left. It is always in this gap, which should not be confused with the negative, that creatures weave their repetition and receive at the same time the gift of living and dying. Finally, to return to nominal concepts. Is it the identity of the nominal concept which explains the repetition of a word? Take the example of rhyme. It is indeed verbal repetition, but repetition which includes the difference between two words and inscribes that difference at the heart of a poetic idea, in a space which it determines. Nor does its meaning lie in marking equal intervals, but rather, as we see in a notion of strong rhyme, in putting tonal values in the service of tonic rhythm, and contributing to the independence of tonic rhythms from arithmetic rhythms. As for the repetition of a single word, we must understand this as a generalized rhyme, not rhyme as a restricted repetition. This generalization can proceed in two ways: either a word taken in two senses ensures a resemblance or a paradoxical identity between the two senses, or a word taken in one sense exercises an attractive force on its neighbors, communicating an extraordinary gravity to them until one of the neighboring words takes up the baton and becomes in turn a center of repetition. Raymond Roussel and Charles Peguy were the great repeaters of literature, able to lift the pathological power of language to a higher artistic level. Roussel takes ambiguous words or homonyms and fills the entire distance between their meanings with a story presented twice and with objects themselves doubled. He thereby overcomes homonymity on its own ground and inscribes the maximum difference within repetition, where this is the space opened up in the heart of a word. This space is still presented by Roussel as one of masks and death, in which is developed both a repetition which enchains and a repetition which saves above all from the one which enchains. Roussel creates an after-language where once everything has been said, everything is repeated and recommenced. Peguy's technique is very different. It substitutes repetition not for homonymity but for synonymity. It concerns what linguists call the function of contiguity rather than that of similarity. It forms a before language, an auroral language in which the step-by-step creation of an internal space within words proceeds by tiny differences. This time, everything leads to the problem of aging and premature deaths, but in relation to this problem also to the extraordinary chance to affirm a repetition which saves against that which enchains. Both Hegel and Roussel take language to one of its limits, in the case of Roussel, that of similarity and selection, the distinctive feature between Ballard and Pillard; in the case of Hegel, that of contiguity or combination, the famous tapestry points. Both substitute a vertical repetition of distinctive points, which takes us inside the words, for the horizontal repetition of ordinary words repeated. Both substitute a positive repetition, one which flows from there. Excess of a linguistic and stylistic idea, for a repetition by default which results from the inadequacy of nominal concepts or verbal representations. How does death inspire language, given that it is always present when repetition is affirmed? The reproduction of the same is not a motor of bodily movements. We know that even the simplest imitation involves a difference between inside and outside. Moreover, imitation plays only a secondary and regulatory role in the acquisition of a behavior. It permits the correction of movements being made, but not their instigation. Learning takes place not in the relation between a representation and an action, reproduction of the same, but in the relation between a sign and a response, encounter with the other. Signs involve heterogeneity in at least three ways: first, in the object which bears or emits them, and is necessarily on a different level, as though there were two orders of size or disparate realities between which the sign flashes; secondly, in themselves, since a sign envelops another object within the limits of the object which bears it, and incarnates a natural or spiritual power, an idea; finally, in the response they elicit, since the movement of the response does not resemble that of the sign. The movement of the swimmer does not resemble that of the wave; in particular, the movements of the swimming instructor which we reproduce on the sand bear no relation to the movements of the wave, which we learn to deal with only by grasping the former in practice as signs. That is why it is so difficult to say how someone learns. There is an innate or acquired practical familiarity with signs, which means that there is something amorous, but also something fatal, about all education. We learn nothing from those who say, "Do as I do." Our only teachers are those who tell us to do with me, and are able to emit signs to be developed in heterogeneity rather than propose gestures for us to reproduce. In other words, there is no idea motivity, only sensory motivity. When a body combines some of its own distinctive points with those of a wave, it espouses the principle of a repetition which is no longer that of the same, but involves the other, involves difference, from one wave and one gesture to another, and carries that difference through the repetitive space thereby constituted. To learn is indeed to constitute this space of an encounter with signs, in which the distinctive points renew themselves in each other, and repetition takes shape while disguising itself. Apprenticeship always gives rise to images of death, on the edges of the space it creates and with the help of the heterogeneity it engenders. Signs are deadly when they are lost in the distance, but also when they strike us with full force. Oedipus receives a sign once from too far away, once from too close, and between the two a terrible repetition of the crime is woven. Zarathustra receives his sign either from too near or from too far, and only at the end does he foresee the correct distance which will turn that which in eternal return makes him ill into a liberatory and redemptive repetition. Signs are the true elements of theatre. They testify to the spiritual and natural powers which act beneath the words, gestures, characters and objects represented. They signify repetition as real movement, in opposition to representation which is a false movement of the abstract. We are right to speak of repetition when we find ourselves confronted by identical elements with exactly the same concept. However, we must distinguish between these discrete elements, these repeated objects, and a secret subject, the real subject of repetition, which repeats itself through them. Repetition must be understood in the pronominal. We must find the self of repetition, the singularity within that which repeats. For there is no repetition without a repeater, nothing repeated without a repetitious soul. As a result, rather than the repeated and the repeater, the object and the subject, we must distinguish two forms of repetition. In every case repetition is difference without a concept. But in one case, the difference is taken to be only external to the concept. It is a difference between objects represented by the same concept, falling into the indifference of space and time. In the other case, the difference is internal to the idea, it unfolds as pure movement, creative of a dynamic space and time which correspond to the idea. The first repetition is repetition of the same, explained by the identity of the concept or representation; the second includes difference, and includes itself in the alterity of the idea, in the heterogeneity of an A presentation. One is negative, occurring by default in the concept; the other affirmative, occurring by excess in the idea. One is conjectural, the other categorical. One is static, the other dynamic. One is repetition in the effect, the other in the cause. One is extensive, the other intensive. One is ordinary, the other distinctive and singular. One is horizontal, the other vertical. One is developed and explicated, the other enveloped and in need of interpretation. One is revolving, the other evolving. One involves equality, commensurability and symmetry, the other is grounded in inequality, incommensurability and dissymmetry. One is material, the other spiritual, even in nature and in the earth. One is inanimate, the other carries the secret of our deaths and our lives, of our enchainments and our liberations, the demonic and the divine. One is a bare repetition, the other a covered repetition, which forms itself in covering itself, in masking and disguising itself. One concerns accuracy, the other has authenticity as its criterion. The two repetitions are not independent. One is the singular subject, the interiority and the heart of the other, the depths of the other. The other is only the external envelope, the abstract effect. The repetition of dissymmetry is hidden within symmetrical ensembles or effects, a repetition of distinctive points underneath that of ordinary points, and everywhere the other in the repetition of the same. This is the secret. The most profound repetition, it alone provides the principle of the other one, the reason for the blockage of concepts. In this domain, as in Sartori's Artus, it is the masked, the disguised or the costumed which turns out to be the truth of the uncovered. Necessarily, since this repetition is not hidden by something else but forms itself by disguising itself, it does not pre-exist its own disguises and, in forming itself, constitutes the bare repetition within which it becomes enveloped. Important consequences follow from this. When we are confronted by a repetition which proceeds masked, or comprises displacements, quickenings, slowdowns, variants or differences which are ultimately capable of leading us far away from the point of departure, we tend to see a mixed state in which repetition is not pure but only approximative. The very word repetition seems to be employed symbolically, by analogy or metaphor. It is true that we have strictly defined repetition as difference without concept. However, we would be wrong to reduce it to a difference which falls back into exteriority, because the concept embodies the form of the same, without seeing that it can be internal to the idea and possess in itself all the resources of signs, symbols and alterity which go beyond the concept as such. The examples invoked above concern the most diverse kinds of case, from nominal concepts to concepts of nature and freedom, and we could be charged with having mixed up all kinds of physical and psychical repetitions, even with having run together stereotypical repetitions and latent, symbolic repetitions in the psychical domain. However, we wished to show the coexistence of these instances in every repetitive structure, to show how repetition displays identical elements which necessarily refer back to a latent subject which repeats itself through these elements, forming another repetition at the heart of the first. We therefore suggest that this other repetition is in no way approximative or metaphorical. It is, on the contrary, the spirit of every repetition. It is the very letter of every repetition, its watermark or constitutive cipher. It forms the essence of that in which every repetition consists, difference without a concept, non-mediated difference. It is both the literal and spiritual primary sense of repetition. The material sense results from this other, as if secreted by it like a shell. We began by distinguishing generality and repetition. Then we distinguished two forms of repetition. These two distinctions are linked. The consequences of the first are unfolded only in the second. For if we were content to treat repetition abstractly and as devoid of any interior, we would remain incapable of understanding why and how a concept could be naturally blocked, allowing a repetition which has nothing to do with generality to appear. Conversely, when we discover the literal interior of repetition, we have the means not only to understand the outer repetition as a cover, but also to recapture the order of generality, and, following Kierkegaard's wish, to carry out the reconciliation of the singular with the general. For to the extent that the internal repetition projects itself through a bare repetition which covers it, the differences that it includes appear to be so many factors which oppose repetition, which attenuate it and vary it according to general laws. Beneath the general operation of laws, however, there always remains the play of singularities. Cyclical generalities in nature are the masks of a singularity which appears through their interferences, and beneath the generalities of habit in moral life we rediscover singular processes of learning. The domain of laws must be understood, but always on the basis of a nature and a spirit superior to their own laws, which weave their repetitions in the depths of the earth and of the heart, where laws do not yet exist. The interior of repetition is always affected by an order of difference. It is only to the extent that something is linked to a repetition of an order other than its own that the repetition appears external and bare, and the thing itself subject to the categories of generality. It is the inadequation between difference and repetition which gives rise to the order of generality. Gabriel Tarde suggested in this sense that resemblance itself was only displaced repetition. Real repetition is that which corresponds directly to a difference of the same degree as itself. Better than anyone, Tarde was able to elaborate a new dialectic by discovering in mind and nature the secret effort to establish an ever more perfect correspondence between difference and repetition. So long as we take difference to be conceptual difference, intrinsically conceptual, and repetition to be an extrinsic difference between objects represented by the same concept, it appears that the problem of their relation may be resolved by the facts. Are the repetitions, yes or no? Or is every difference indeed intrinsic and conceptual in the last instance? Hegel ridiculed Leibniz for having invited the court ladies to undertake experimental metaphysics while walking in the gardens, to see whether two leaves of a tree could not have the same concept. Replace the court ladies by forensic scientists. No two grains of dust are absolutely identical, no two hands have the same distinctive points, no two typewriters have the same strike, no two revolvers score their bullets in the same manner. Why, however, do we feel that the problem is not properly defined so long as we look for the criterion of a principium individuationis in the facts? It is because a difference can be internal, yet not conceptual, as the paradox of symmetrical objects shows. A dynamic space must be defined from the point of view of an observer tied to that space, not from an external position. There are internal differences which dramatize an idea before representing an object. Difference here is internal to an idea, even though it be external to the concept which represents an object. That is why the opposition between Kant and Leibniz seems much less strong to the extent that one takes account of the dynamic factors present in the two doctrines. If, in the forms of intuition, Kant recognized extrinsic differences not reducible to the order of concepts, these are no less internal even though they cannot be regarded as intrinsic by the understanding, and can be represented only in their external relation to space as a whole. In other words, following certain neo-Kantian interpretations, there is a step-by-step, internal, dynamic construction of space which must precede the representation of the whole as a form of exteriority. The element of this internal genesis seems to us to consist of intensive quantity rather than schema, and to be related to ideas rather than to concepts of the understanding. If the spatial order of extrinsic differences and the conceptual order of intrinsic differences are finally in harmony, as the schema shows they are, this is ultimately due to this intensive differential element, this synthesis of continuity at a given moment which, in the form of a continua repetitio, first gives rise internally to the space corresponding to ideas. With Leibniz, the affinity between extrinsic differences and intrinsic conceptual differences already appealed to the internal process of a continua repetitio, grounded upon an intensive differential element which ensures the synthesis of continuity at a point in order to engender space from within. There are repetitions which are not only extrinsic differences, just as there are internal differences which are neither intrinsic nor conceptual. We are thus in a better position to identify the source of the preceding ambiguities. When we define repetition as difference without concept, we are drawn to conclude that only extrinsic difference is involved in repetition. We consider, therefore, that any internal novelty is sufficient to remove us from repetition proper and can be reconciled only with an approximative repetition, so called by analogy. Nothing of the sort is true. For we do not yet know what is the essence of repetition, what is positively denoted by the expression difference without concept, or the nature of the interiority it may imply. Conversely, when we define difference as conceptual difference, we believe we have done enough to specify the concept of difference as such. Nevertheless, here again we have no idea of difference, no concept of difference as such. Perhaps the mistake of the philosophy of difference, from Aristotle to Hegel via Leibniz, lay in confusing the concept of difference with a merely conceptual difference, in remaining content to inscribe difference in the concept in general. In reality, so long as we inscribe difference in the concept in general we have no singular idea of difference, we remain only with a difference already mediated by representation. We therefore find ourselves confronted by two questions: what is the concept of difference, one which is not reducible to simple conceptual difference but demands its own idea, its own singularity at the level of ideas? On the other hand, what is the essence of repetition? One which is not reducible to difference without concept, and cannot be confused with the apparent character of objects represented by the same concept, but bears witness to singularity as a power of ideas. The meeting between these two notions, difference and repetition, can no longer be assumed. It must come about as a result of interferences and intersections between these two lines, one concerning the essence of repetition, the other the idea of difference.